On the evening of November 1842, the candles in St. Bartholomew Parish shone brighter than the moon. A fiddler tuned a reel in the Davenport parlor. The cut-glass goblets caught firelight like small comets, and somebody in a coat too warm for the weather laughed at a joke that would not be funny in an hour. Salt air rolled in from the marsh and threaded itself through magnolia and roast goose until the whole night smelled like a celebration you could taste. It sounded like money and confidence and a future already written. It looked, to anyone passing on the river road, like the safest house in South Carolina. There is a trick the Lowcountry plays on the uninitiated. It makes still water look harmless. It hides the turn of the tide behind blades of grass that only locals watch. The Davenport place, high on a ridge of dry ground, locals called Cypress Bluff, loved that trick. From the porch, you could see every approach. Oak alley to the front, rice fields turned copper in late sun, and set back a careful distance. The detached brick kitchen, where the real weather of a big house rose and fell. Inside that kitchen, the air ran hotter, and the clocks ran faster. A woman named Ruth kept time with a wooden spoon, and her daughter, Clara, learned the rhythm so well she could stir 3 pots without looking down. If you've never stood in a Lowcountry kitchen where a wedding feast is being born, imagine the heat of a summer noon packed into a single room and fed with hickory. Imagine copper boiling, goose fat crackling, coffee dark as river water bubbling in a tall pot, sugar shivering in a pan until it decides to turn. Imagine hands that never stop washing, slicing, lifting, testing, and the senses tuned to survival. A nose that knows when flour is tired, an ear that hears when a lid is lying, fingers that can judge a roast from a touch that lasts the length of a heartbeat. That was Ruth. And that was Clara, who moved through that room like water poured from a jug. Quiet. Quick. Everywhere at once. Clara was not a child, though the men of the parish liked to call every woman in a plain dress girl, as if naming made ownership. She was 20 that year, perhaps a shade more, depending which ledger you believed, and she carried the kind of stillness you mistake for meekness until you see the eyes. On ordinary days, her eyes held a patient dark, the look of someone who understands that safety is an illusion you make in small pieces and mend every morning. Tonight they held something else. If you noticed it, you might have thought it was the reflection of candle flames. If you knew her, you would have called it a tide turning. The invitation said Davenport Price, which sounded like a merger because it was. Thomas Alton Davenport merchant's son, magistrate when it suited him, colonel of the militia when the uniform fit, had a boy named Calvin, with a smile he wore like a borrowed hat. The Price family downriver had a daughter named Annabelle, with a dowry and a spine. In a season that had brought too many funerals, people wanted a wedding the way a parched field wants rain. The parish pastor wrote in his diary, "A good union for 2 houses, may the Lord bless it." And then, 2 lines later, visited Davenport's to rebuke the household for unseemly familiarity. Wasn't received. He underlined not. On the blank flyleaf of that same diary, in a different hand, there would later be a pencil line that bent the spine of this story. We'll come to it when the night is ready. From the front of the big house, Cypress Bluff looked prepared for happiness, the way a stage looks prepared for a play. Inside the kitchen, there was very little theater. There were lists, and there were tasks that did not care about mood. Ruth kept her counsel and her pace. Clara kept her breath even. She polished the pewter until it held a faint, moon-colored shine, and set it near the north window where the air could lay its cool hands upon it. She tasted the coffee, added a breath of ground chicory, and did not look at the doorway to the hall. Looking was a form of speech. Silence was safer. The parcel from town had arrived that morning, paper cones of spice and other things wrapped with string, and a grocer's bill tucked under the twine. Ruth opened each cone and labored over the small ritual of smelling, pinching, weighing with a glance. She kept what was true. She set aside what was not. In places where money makes rules, women like Ruth practice a different law. The law of the pot, the law of the table. The law that says some things go in and some things do not. If you've never watched a master remove danger as if skimming fat, you might think she was choosing flavors. She was choosing fates. At the back step, a woman in plain clothes paused long enough to be noticed, and not so long that anyone could say they had seen her. She was older than Ruth by 5, 10, maybe 15 years, the kind who could pass through a doorway and become part of its frame. She lifted a hand in greeting so small it could have meant anything. Ruth lifted hers in reply. The woman left down the river path, and Clara felt rather than saw Ruth's gaze rest on her, light as a palm on a shoulder. You might be wondering already who did what and how. If you came for instructions, you won't find them here. We won't name the thing that makes a mouth taste like pennies, not because history doesn't know the word, but because this story is about intention, not ingredients. It's about a promise older than any grocer's bill and sharper than any kitchen knife. If you keep listening, you will understand the promise by the time the pastor finds the pencil line. By late afternoon, the yard had become a geography of celebration. Men carried trestles from the smokehouse and set them beneath the live oaks. Children ran in loops that served no purpose but joy. Women in silk and muslin arrived in pairs and threes, the wheels of their carriages cutting clean black curves into the hard earth. In the parlor, a clock chimed the quarter hour, proud of its brass, and in the hall the bride's laughter skipped ahead of her like a stone thrown down a well. In the kitchen, the clock was a different instrument, the rise and fall of heat, the count of breaths between lifting a lid and setting it back, the long, slow measure of sugar turning toward amber and stopping just in time. Clara placed a small cake on the table by the north window and watched the way light touched its surface. There are moments, even inside a life built on other people's decisions, when you hold something that is yours. It can be as small as a cake. It can be as heavy as a sentence you intend to write. It can be both. The ceremony itself was quick. The pastor read from Corinthians. The groom squeezed the bride's fingers with a confidence that had not yet learned humility. The congregation released a collective breath, as if an illness had briefly abated. In the lull between vows and meat, people turn into their truest selves. Some compare fortunes. Some look for someone else's eyes. Some take comfort in the choreography of dishes arriving and cups being filled. In that interval, Clara moved from kitchen to hall with a grace that made her invisible. This is a talent learned by people who must not be remembered at the end of the night. The first cups were lifted in the hall, and a cheer went up that almost reached the kitchen. Davenport took a goblet, and, without waiting for silence, held it to the air. "To family," he said, which was the kind of sentence a man like that could say, without irony, only because he did not inventory the meaning of his words. The groom echoed him. The bride tried to drink like a lady and smiled like a girl who did not yet know what a house can do to a woman. The fiddler nodded to a tune and decided against it. A cousin in a blue coat laughed too loudly because some men are built to agree with rooms. When the bride's knees gave out, the room mistook it for too much joy. The women made a breeze with their fans. The pastor put his hand to her cheek and said her name softly, as if calling a skittish animal. A man in a blue coat coughed into his fist and looked at what he found there with private confusion. The groom's jaw worked as though grinding a kernel between molars. In the kitchen, Ruth set down her knife so gently you might have thought she was teaching it manners. Clara kept moving. There's a threshold between panic and purpose. She did not cross it. By the time 3 men went outside to breathe air that did not help, the doctor had been sent for. He was one of those Lowcountry men who can pull a tooth, trespass in a belly, and sign a bill with the same authority. He arrived at a trot, removed his coat with an efficient sorrow, and applied his learning. It was an old learning, and a narrow one. Within minutes, he was writing notes he would never show a court. Within an hour, the house had become a place where prayers sounded like business, transacted in a language only God pretended to understand. Let us leave that room for a moment and sit with the pastor, who had retreated to the church to steady his mind. If you want to know how a story survives when the people who lived it are gone, watch what a pastor does with a book. He opened his diary, wrote the date, and set down words with the careful hand of a man who knows that ink can outlive a body. He copied a hymn to calm himself. Somewhere between, there is a fountain filled with blood, and the next line, the paper received a different pressure, a different hand, a sentence made of graphite and decision. I kept the promise. No name, no flourish. Just enough weight to leave a mark that would survive a storm and an era. When the pastor later pretended not to have seen the line when it was fresh, he was doing what men in his position have always done, serving 2 masters and saving one. Back at the house, Davenport ordered the punch carried outside, and the kitchen searched. He did not know what he was searching for, only that men like him believe every disaster has a culprit that can be corrected with the proper application of force. Ruth stood straight. Clara stacked plates, wiped the trestle clean, and placed those same plates into the washtub with tenderness that would have made a kinder world proud. In a life where your choices are surveilled, sometimes your rebellion is housekeeping. By midnight, the hall had stopped shouting. Chairs announced their movements with timid scrapes. Glass ticked as it cooled. The fiddler put his bow in its case because he did not trust his hands. The doctor took the bride's pulse and wrote another line he would later cross out. Davenport demanded answers that did not exist. The overseer practiced a face he imagined a judge might wear. The servants fetched water without spilling and were accused of indifference for not weeping. We have a way, in this country, of misunderstanding the faces of people who are surviving. At some point, accounts disagree by an hour and a witness, the pantry was opened by order. Ruth lifted the latch with fingers that had cooled themselves against the stone sill. Inside were the ordinary engines of a grand meal: flour, salt, sugar, jars that caught candlelight in their bellies, and 3 paper cones of powders, 2 familiar, one less so. She took each in turn, opened, smelled, and poured the contents into the fire. The overseer asked what they had been. "Unfit," said Ruth. "On whose say?" said the man. "Mine," said Ruth, who had authority only in the country of the kitchen and ruled it like a just queen. "If what you want right now is an arrest or a confession, this story will trouble you." What happened next was not a trial. It was the American South. Men with power asked questions. Women with no rights answered carefully. A ledger was consulted. A bill was produced. The doctor took custody of nothing and responsibility for less. The pastor closed his book and did not look at the new line bleeding through the paper. And Clara, who had carried platters through that hall, like hours through a day, folded a cloth, took it to the basin, and began to wash it as if the world were still the world she had woken to that morning. Before dawn, a cart left the Davenport place by the river road. If you had been the kind of person who walks at that hour, and there are such people in the Lowcountry, night fishermen and mothers with worries, you might have seen it. You might have noticed the way the driver did not look toward the house, and the way a second figure on foot kept to the edge where palmetto and shadow could work together. You might have noticed the bundle on her head and how steady it rode. You might have told yourself it was laundry going to the quarters to be clear of the big house before the day's heat. You might have told yourself anything that made sleep possible next night. When the morning became official, when roosters affirmed it, and the parish sexton lamented it, the house called for the law. The sheriff came. He liked the way his boots sounded on other people's floors. He asked where the cook was. "At her work," said the overseer, and even he did not like the way that sentence came out of his mouth. Ruth stood in the kitchen with her sleeves pushed back and answered with the truth that would do the least harm. Clara was asked for and couldn't be found. That happens sometimes when the world cracks open. People fall through the seam they have been polishing in secret for years. The coroner arrived with a competence he wore like a habit. He examined what a man can examine when he does not know how to look at a story. He wrote something that, in a different century, would be called cause. The sheriff looked for evidence that would let him do what he had ridden here to do. He found very little. The pantry, scrubbed within an inch of its life, offered nothing but the normal anchors of a southern kitchen. The grocer's cone of powder the household had bought months earlier sat nearly as full as its receipt claimed it should be. The doctor pursed his lips in a manner he had been taught at a distance by men with better books and worse hearts. The pastor, who knew where the truth lived, said nothing that helped. Word wound itself through the parish like smoke. It carried blame the way smoke carries sparks. Some said an accident. Some said a judgment. Some said a hand had been guided by grief that had never found a place to set itself down. Those whose lives depended upon pleasing the house learned and repeated the safest line. A sickness came over the guests as swiftly as a summer storm, and all hands did their utmost to bring comfort. Those whose lives did not depend on pleasing the house repeated nothing. Silence can be a mercy and a truce and a weapon. On Cypress Bluff it was all three. Clara's name appeared in the Davenport ledger twice, and then never again. The first time it read, "Ruth's girl," with a value written in figures that will curdle your breakfast if you dwell on them. The second time, it read a word that pretends to be neutral and is not. Absconded. The pen faltered halfway through the D, as if even ink had doubts. If you ask the river men who pulled their skiffs before dawn, they will tell you what they tell strangers. The channels change. The shoals move. A person could step where she stepped yesterday and find water where the ground should be. If you ask the women who trade herbs and secrets along the creek, they will tell you a different thing. A woman who knows the edges of a kitchen learns the edges of a county by listening. She learns where the hands that help are and how to reach them without asking out loud. Weeks later, the pastor opened his diary to press a fern he had picked during a funeral. He saw again the pencil line and put his thumb over it, as if he could warm it back into speech. I kept the promise. He turned the book and read the line in lamplight, in river light, in the uncertain light of a man who fears his own memory. Then he closed the diary and hid it under the altar. When a storm tore shingles from the church years later and rain walked down the center aisle, the diary took on water and gave up some ink, but kept its pencil. When the war came and men prayed for victory like it was a sacrament, the diary lived under a floorboard and learned patience. When the war ended and nothing ended, the diary came back out into air that was not new. That is how a sentence survives. You want to know what happened to Clara? The rumor has two roads, as Southern rumors do. The road where she drowned and the road where she lived long enough to change her name. On the drowning road, she walked into the river the way a person walks into a room she has been told is hers, and found it cold, swift, and indifferent. On the other road, she followed the marsh banks at low tide and met a woman at a cypress, marked with a nail cross, and from there she was passed, hand to hand, like a prayer. On both roads, she is brave. On both roads, she is a mother who ran out of lawful options. On both roads, the men who make proclamations about order and civilization are late to every crucial moment. A month after the wedding that didn't finish, a courier from town brought a packet to the sheriff. Inside were letters from planters in 2 neighboring counties. Their language wore panic like a borrowed coat. Kitchens were being locked at night. Food tasters, a medieval answer to a modern conscience, had become a fad. There were rumors of other houses where death had arrived with dinner. The sheriff wrote replies that attempted calm. The doctor spoke at a meeting and said words like natural causes and fortuitous timing. The pastor preached on forgiveness and looked at the faces of women in plain dresses and wondered what forgiveness means when the sin has been legal for 200 years. This is where our story could end, if it were a neat story. But what holds a listener is not neatness, it is consequence. Think of the quarters at Cypress Bluff in the weeks after. By lamplight, people argued in whispers about whether to tell the truth that would doom them or hold to the story that would save them. By daylight, they returned to work because muscle remembers what a contract erases. A boy practicing letters with a stick in dirt wrote a word he was not supposed to know and scuffed it out with his heel. An old man who had lost fingers to someone's temper practiced smiling for the first time in a year and frightened himself with the unfamiliar sensation. There is an account, the kind you find scrawled decades later in the margin of a land deed, because that is where people put things they are not sure they should say, that claims Clara did not mean to poison a wedding. According to this scrap, she meant to end one man and found a roomful instead. According to another scrap, older and meaner, She meant exactly what happened, and the calculation was not unkind. Here is what we know without a scrap. A pencil line in a pastor's diary says, "I kept the promise." Not I kept the plan. Not I kept the recipe. A promise. Ask any mother what promises are made when children are sold off a porch. Ask any woman what promises are made in a kitchen when a hand she did not invite reaches for her, in the doorway, at midnight. Some promises have only one way to keep them. The story moved upriver and changed accents as it went. In Charleston, it became a cautionary tale told over tea. In Augusta, it became a story planters told each other, as if fear were a tonic. In New Orleans, it became gossip in a market where spices and people were priced by weight, and the human voice could be as sharp as any blade. Along the way, Clara's face was adjusted to suit the teller. In some mouths, she became a demon. In others, she became a saint. The truth is harder and more ordinary. She was a woman who understood the tools within reach and used them. Years later, how many depends upon who is counting. A ledger in a northern city recorded payments made in an odd sum, $37, repeated, sent anonymously to a school for black children and a home for women who had left men who owned them. No note, no signature, just the kind of number that means a private thing to the person who writes it. A woman in a bonnet no one noticed left the money with a gloved hand and kept walking. On a different page in a different city, a boarding house mistress named Martha Washington hired a cook who had a way of seasoning soup that could make you remember your mother, and a habit of wearing gloves even when it was hot. A doctor with a careful mind died and left a sealed letter for his son saying, in phrases that tried to be clinical and failed, that sometimes the river is owed a secret. If you are listening from far away and wondering whether any of this really happened, let me tell you something honest. The dates line up more often than the names. The Lowcountry is full of lost paper and found voices. I have read enough county books to know that what is called a rumor in one decade becomes a footnote in the next and a plaque 100 years later. I have read enough diaries to recognize a sentence that was written with a mouth full of iron and salt. I have stood under live oaks where people learned their letters in whispers and watched the way the light sifts through moss like ash. I have watched a tide turn and seen how the surface doesn't change much while everything underneath reverses. Do you need an ending? People do. Here is one that satisfies without pretending. A train north stopped in a city where the river is the color of coffee with milk. A woman stepped down from the colored car wearing a dress that made her look like someone's aunt. She carried a bundle that wasn't heavy and a prayer that was. She walked to a church that taught reading at night and asked for the pastor's wife. On her wrist, under the glove, a thin old scar caught the lamplight like a thread. Years later, a girl whose mother was too tired to keep a story straight would swear that the woman taught her to make bread without measuring because the hand knows, and to read by tasting the shape the word made in your mouth. That girl grew up to sign her name without apology and to teach her own daughter a hymn that had no melody, only a kind of humming that felt like a promise kept. When she was asked who taught her the song, she said, "A cook," and would say nothing more. Another ending, if you prefer your sharp. A sheriff on a dock far from home watched men drag a muddy river and told himself he was looking for a body when what he wanted was absolution. A doctor who had learned more from women than from books held a journal that smelled faintly of smoke and magnolia and chose silence. A planter died far away with a name nobody recognized him by, and the son he had once been did not show up to his funeral because the law in his new town did not know his face. The pastor grew old and ended his entries with fewer words, as if language itself had become a burden. The diary outlived him, as books are prone to do. But perhaps the ending that belongs to us, the ending a listener in any century can use, happened in the space between seasoning and serving, where intention lives. A woman in a kitchen looked at a world that called itself orderly and saw something crooked. She had no ballot and no jury. She had flame and water and time and the intelligence God gave her. She wrote a sentence not with ink, but with consequence, and set it where a man charged with remembering would eventually be forced to see it. I kept the promise. If you are watching from Detroit or Dallas or a kitchen in the valley where the air hums with refrigerator Freon and the only moss is on a screensaver, understand this. The past is not a foreign country. It is the room you're in with the lights off. Stories like this one do not ask to be believed. They ask to be carried carefully so they do not spill and scald. The wedding at Cypress Bluff never finished. The toasts remained half-raised forever. The bride became a woman who closed her curtains on anniversaries. The groom learned a humility that looked like geography and moved west until the map forgot him. The house changed hands and then meanings. People stopped saying Davenport and started saying the place with the promise. The kitchen was torn down and rebuilt twice, and then made into a museum where, on very hot days, the guide will tell you if you lean close to the hearth, you can smell a sweetness that is not sugar and a bitterness that is not coffee. It is nonsense, of course. Or it is memory. And if, late at night, you flip through an old hymn book in a country church and find a line in pencil that doesn't belong to the hymn, feel the weight of that graphite. Consider what it takes for a sentence to cross a century. Consider what it means for a woman with no legal name to leave behind words that outlived magistrates and uniforms and men in blue coats who never learned the difference between a room falling silent from awe and a room falling silent from fear. Consider that a promise can be a map and a mercy and a verdict all at once. Then close the book, blow out the candle, let the tide turn in the marsh outside. Somewhere, on some road you can't see from where you are, a woman is walking with a bundle that rides steady on her head and a prayer that doesn't rhyme. She has kept the promise. That is enough. Now you know why the parish stopped counting bells that winter. Now you know why the old men at the feed store still lower their voices when a wedding procession passes under live oaks. Now you know why, in certain kitchens, women teach their daughters to taste without swallowing. And if you ask whether Clara drowned or crossed, whether she became Martha or none of the above, whether the diary's pencil belonged to her hand or to another's, I will tell you the only honest thing a storyteller can say when history leaves the last page blank. The river knows, and the river has never been in the habit of confessing. Listen to the insects. Hear how they keep the night going, even when the people in the big house have nothing left to say. Somewhere near the church, The pastor's grandson is learning to write his name and pressing too hard on the pencil. Somewhere near the marsh, the woman in plain clothes who lifted her hand like a small wave is doing the same thing she always does, moving women along the road without leaving a footprint, taking payment in gratitude and the occasional loaf of bread. Somewhere in a northern city, a teacher is explaining to a room of children that a promise is a kind of math, the sum of grief and time and courage, carried over from one line to the next until the ledger balances in a place no sheriff can audit. If you've stayed with me this long, if the candles at your desk have burned lower while we talked, you already understand something about retention that the platforms will never admit. People remain where truth is treated as a living thing, not the kind you pin to a board for display, the kind that breathes and makes choices and sometimes walks into a river rather than return to a house that calls itself home, the kind that adds precisely one sentence to a hymn book and trusts strangers, us to carry it the rest of the way. So let the Davenport wedding stand in your mind as a room full of cut glass stars and a bride left standing between a vow and a season of funerals, as a kitchen where two women steered a ship through a narrow channel, as a church where a pastor discovered that the earliest form of justice is sometimes a line in pencil. Let it stand for the notion that intention is the sharpest tool a human being can own. And if you feel a shiver when you pass a table laid for company, if you catch the faintest penny taste in a story told too sweet, if you see a woman lift her hand in a greeting, small enough to be mistaken for shooing a fly, you will know what the people of St. Bartholomew Parish eventually learned. Some promises, once made, do not ask your permission before they are kept. There is a coda because the South loves codas almost as much as it loves porches. Many years after the night the fiddler put away his bow, a plain wooden box was opened during repairs in the choir loft. Inside lay a bundle of papers tied with string, pew charts, marriage bands, receipts for candles. At the bottom, wrapped in a hymn page, was the pastor's diary. The ink had bled in the storm I mentioned, turning words to small black C's, but the pencil line still held. A woman dusting the loft read it out loud without thinking, the way people read grocery lists out loud. I kept the promise. The choir ladies asked what promise, and she shook her head as if waking. "I don't know," she said. But somebody did. They put the diary back and told no one, because some stories prefer to be discovered by the right ears at the right time. If this feels unfinished, good. The work of the living is to finish what the dead began when they pressed their sentences into books we weren't supposed to open. The work of the listening is to carry those sentences through the dark without spilling them. The work of the young is to set new tables where no one is owned, to light new candles in rooms where no one has to pretend. And the work of the old, perhaps, is simply to remember without turning memory into a weapon aimed at the wrong decade. In the meantime, when you hear the word promise, think of a kitchen full of heat and a woman with a bundle walking away from a house that thought it could hold her. Think of pencil on paper, soft gray against hymn white. Think of a tide turning where the surface pretends not to. Think of a name appearing twice in a book that measured people in currency, and then not again. Think of how long a sentence can last if it is written with intent. Then, if you must have a moral to pin to your corkboard, let it be this. In a country that makes a habit of pretending to be something it is not, the sharpest revenge is to be exactly what the world refuses to reckon with: alive, unowned, and exact in your keeping of promises. Years have a way of growing a rind around a story, but the fruit inside keeps its bite. After Cypress Bluff emptied of music and filled with whispers, the parish continued, because parishes always do. Cotton sprouted. Babies arrived. Men found new reasons to make speeches about Providence. The big house acquired a quiet that visitors called dignified, and locals called a haunting, though nothing in the official records used either word. The kitchen kept producing food because hunger does not care if a promise has already been kept. And yet, if you stood in the doorway where Clara once leaned and watched the room breathe, you might feel a cool seam in the air, like a draft that refuses to seal, and you would know the house still remembered what it had tried to forget. South along the river, a collector of papers, one of those courthouse men who cannot throw anything away, because someday it might matter, filed a letter that smelled faintly of lamp oil and marsh. It described a woman practicing midwifery among the sea islands, a Miss C, who would only sing over the cradle in a language the writer could not identify. The letter called her an angel and a difficulty in the same sentence, which is a sign you're reading truth. It noted that she took no coin for babies born on a Sunday, only a flower pressed between Bible pages. It added, as if meaning to erase what it had just proved, that no such woman could write her name. 2 pages later, in another hand, a marginal note: receipt for books delivered to Miss C primers and a McGuffey, paid an exact sum, $37. The clerk circled the number, not knowing why it felt like a fingerprint. North, where winter has a harder jaw, a man with a head full of catalogs boarded a train with a valise of questions. He had read, then reread, a physician's private notes that said the river sometimes keeps what it's owed. He had walked through Cypress Bluff with a measuring tape and discovered the floor in the dining room was a 1/4 inch lower at the head of the table, as if a weight had settled there and refused to be lifted, even when the furniture was hauled out for polishing. He had talked to women who ran boarding houses with kitchens that smelled like memory and onion skins, and each time he tried to ask their names, they laughed in the way people do when a question is too small for the answer. One of them, gray hair pinned with a straight pin, asked if he knew the difference between a recipe and a story. When he said he did not, she said, "A recipe tells you what to put in. A story tells you what to leave out." Back on the ridge, the pastor's grandson grew into a man who carried his own pencil, soft as number 2, chewed at one end. He went through the church like a caretaker remarrying an old widow, patient with her griefs and particular about her drafts. One storm season, shingles flew, and he climbed to the loft to check for leaks. Up there, the heat is its own weather, the smell of songbooks and dust like an attic that still believes in God. He found the wooden box, the tied bundle, the diary. He did not mean to open it. Making a museum of a church is a kind of sin. But the string was brittle, and the knot gave up without a fight. He read the line once, twice, then put his thumb where his grandfather's must have, and felt the page warm under his skin. He copied the sentence on a slip of paper and carried it in his pocket for a year like a charm. When he finally lost it in the wash, he could still write the words from memory. I kept the promise. By then, he understood that sentences like that live in the mouth more than on the page. There was a bride to consider, the one who laughed like a girl the afternoon before the vows. She did not die, though 2 family stones on the hill carry the same year and the same grief. She lived into a severity that charity mistook for piety. She worked for a mission school after the war, where hunger is a curriculum of its own. When children asked her to sing, she would hum a lullaby with no words, and the other teacher-stern woman, with hands that smelled like soap and lemon, would stop writing figures on the slate and listen as if hearing a text only she could read. If anyone asked the widow Davenport why she never remarried, she said something about a river crossing and changed the subject. Once, visiting the church alone near dusk, she touched the altar rail and whispered, "I forgave her a long time ago." The sexton, sweeping in the vestibule, could not tell whether she meant a woman with a name or a parish with a conscience. In the years when federal agents in stiff coats tried to teach the South to keep books a different way, a Freedmen's Bureau clerk in Beaufort wrote a case file about a midwife who refused payment in coin from soldiers and planters alike, but accepted, without counting, small sums from women whose lives had been measured too many times. The clerk noted she wore gloves in heat that would make a Union officer weep, and that her handwriting, the signature she would not append to official forms, appeared on scraps tucked into prayer books, grocery tallies, and a child's copy sheet. The letter G had a curl at the base that made the clerk think, for reasons he could not explain, of smoke. If you spent any time in the quarters after the promise, you would have heard the phrase "teaching tree" more than once, though no one would point you to it. It had been a literal oak at Cypress Bluff, broad enough to shade a small school, and then it had been a dozen different trees in a dozen different places, because ideas transplant better than some people's hope. Under those branches, women taught children to make their letters in flour, spread thin on planks, in ash on shovel blades, in the fogged glass of winter windows. They taught numbers by counting quilt squares and nails in a hinge. They taught history by telling the truth until it sounded like a psalm. No one is born property. No one is born silence. No one is born to feel a hand on her shoulder in a doorway and think consent is a kind of gratitude. Do you want the ghost story? Because there is always someone who does. Very well. On a July evening a century later, when summer has a habit of turning the South into a warm bath of memory, a docent locked the kitchen door at Cypress Bluff, counted the spoons, and turned back to fetch the shawl she had left on the hearth bench. She found a hymnbook open on the table, though she had not set it there. She closed it and returned it to the shelf by the north window. When she went for her shawl, the book lay open again, a gray breath of graphite crossing one page like a road in fog. She slept poorly that night and dreamed of a woman walking away from a house with a bundle on her head and a song in her throat that had no words, only intention. The docent told no one, because tourists buy hauntings, but donors buy respectability, and budgets are promises of their own. Up north, where the lake is a kind of inland ocean that makes its own weather, a boarding house fed railroad men, stevedores with hands like rope, seamstresses who stitched new names into old collars, and girls fresh from the South with careful eyes. The matron, called Mrs. Washington for reasons the city never learned, moved slower each winter and faster each emergency. She tested every pot herself with a wooden spoon, worn narrow as a finger. And if anyone asked why she insisted on this ritual when the girls could be trusted, she said that taste is how you tell the truth from the story of the truth. On the day she died, quietly, on her own terms, according to the paper that never printed such details about people whose bodies didn't buy headlines, an envelope came to the house addressed in a hand the younger women were learning to imitate. The stamp was Canadian. Inside, 2 folded pages, a school roster with children's names written in tidy rows, and a small pressed flower that made the room smell, just for a moment, like heat and river. The roster columns labeled readers and singers had more checks than the column labeled owned, which bore only a line drawn through it, so dark it blunted the nib. From time to time, a man with a badge and a budget would come through the boarding house neighborhood and ask after a woman who had once been a byword. He had files that had yellowed into myth and a professional hatred of mysteries that made the rank above his look at him like a useful dog. "You ever know a Clara?" he'd ask, and the old ones would smile and say, "I know 100 Claras, son. Which promise are you looking for?" He would go away offended, as if wit were an obstruction of justice, and the girls would learn again how to answer questions by answering none. Back at Cypress Bluff, a carpenter pulled up a section of floor while repairing a sag no rug could hide. In the joist bay lay a child's marble, a clay pipe, and the stub of a pencil. The carpenter kept the marble for his boy. He put the pipe on the mantel because men collect their own ghosts. He set the pencil in a drawer in the little office, where the docents keep their paper crowns for school groups and their brochures about heritage. Years later, during a storm that shook the oak alley like bones in a jar, lightning kissed the chimney and ran a finger along the attic beam. The house shuddered. Downstairs, the drawer slid open by an inch, and the pencil rolled forward as if a hand had reached for it. The docent who found it there the next morning picked it up, and her palm came away faintly gray. She wiped her hand on her skirt and laughed at herself for being dramatic. That afternoon she told the story anyway, because sometimes drama is simply accuracy with better lighting. You may be wondering what became of the sheriff who liked how his boots sounded on other people's floors. He lived long enough to tell a version of the Cypress Bluff affair in a bar 3 counties away where no one knew to measure his words. In his story, he almost caught a woman at a ferry landing where the river curls like a question mark. In his story, she turned and looked at him, and he saw in her face not fear but fatigue, the particular kind that belongs to people who have had to calculate every breath for years. He put his hand on his pistol and found he did not want to draw it. He did not say this part out loud. He finished his whiskey and told the men at the bar that the lesson of the whole mess was never to trust a kitchen. One of the men, whose mother had kept him alive with broth and lies during a fever year, did not come back to that bar. The doctor, yes, the one with the careful notes, grew old enough to doubt the certainties that had once bought him respect. In the last ledger he kept, there are 3 blank pages near the end, a luxury no physician allows unless it is on purpose. On the last page with writing, a sentence runs longer than his training would have liked. Some acts, examined at the longitude of law, are crimes. Examined at the latitude of loss, they are maps. The son who inherited his practice also inherited a sealed envelope he burned, because guilt is a kind of heat, and sons are not always as brave as fathers hope. When people from away come to the Lowcountry and ask for a true ghost story, the guides who have learned that truth pays less than spectacle sometimes give them the other kind. They tell of a white lady in a long corridor and a candle that won't stay lit. But if the guide likes you, if the heat has gentled your face and your questions carry no sharp edges, they may walk you past the parlor to the brick cookhouse and let you stand there until the sweat runs into your collar. They will tell you about two women who ran a room like a ship and steered it through a needle's eye. They will not say Clara unless you do first. They will not say arsenic at all. They might say promise, and they might say ledger, and they might, if the cicadas are loud enough to cover a little heresy, say justice. An evening came years after the war when a woman with the maiden name Davenport, no relation, not really, just the way names stick to places, sat on the church steps with a Yankee whose money paid for new pew cushions and the kind of paint that resists humidity. She said she felt sorry for the bride every time she heard the story, and sorrier for the woman who kept her word, because living with that kind of memory is its own rope. The Yankee said he felt sorry for the men, because men never see it coming. She looked at him as if he'd given the wrong answer on purpose, and said, "Sir, everything that comes has been coming a long time. You just don't read the signs scribbled in the margins." Once, during a summer when the river was low and the mud showed its spine, a boy found a jar in the bank below the kitchen garden. Inside were paper scraps gone soft as bread. His aunt, who knew more about preservation than church ladies do about casseroles, lifted the fragments with a butter knife and set them in a row on a clean tea towel. The top piece held only 3 letters before the paper ended. Pro. The aunt smiled without humor and said, "That's enough to know who wrote it." She put the scraps back in the jar with a sprig of rosemary, as if giving the words a friend, and they buried it again where the roots could watch over it. The boy grew up and told his daughter to plant rosemary at her back door for remembrance and for sauces. She did, and taught her own daughter to crush a leaf between finger and thumb and listen to what it says. If you need one more glimpse of Clara that feels like the kind of proof people mistake for truth, imagine this. A train ticket clerk in Detroit with a fondness for neat ledgers remembers, years later, a woman who bought 3 tickets using 2 names and an accent that slid between counties like a boat changing channels. He remembers because the sum she handed him did not require change, and because she wore gloves when no one else did that week. He remembers because she hummed while he counted, and the tune had no melody he recognized, only a rhythm that made him want to stand up straighter. Let us not forget Ruth, who lifted a latch with a steady hand, while men invented certainty around her. She appears in a Reconstruction payroll as a laundress for a school that taught more reading than scripture. The payroll notes her as punctual and dignified, the kind of faint praise that covers gratitude like a thin blanket. There is a rumor she was buried with a kitchen spoon in her hand, not because she couldn't let work go, but because the women who loved her understood some tools are scepters, and some queens choose their crowns. Her grave faced east. On Easter mornings, the sun slid up the river like a coin offered back after a debt you never owed. The last time the choir ladies handled the pastor's diary, older now, soft-spined, they debated whether to place it behind glass. One said yes, because glass keeps hands off. Another said no, because glass keeps breath off, and breath is what turns a sentence into a prayer. They compromised, as churchwomen do, by putting the book in a case with a hinge and leaving the key where everyone could find it if they bothered to look. On humid days, the glass fogs. The custodian wipes it with a rag and notices every time the faintest gray streak left behind, as if the book were trying to write one more line. And you, watching from a kitchen or a bus or a break room where the microwave insists upon its own schedule, carry this forward in the way that costs you least and matters most. When you hear someone call a woman a girl to make her smaller, hear the ledger scratching in the background and turn the page. When you taste a sweetness that seems a little off, consider whether you are being fed a story that has left out the one ingredient that matters, intention. When you pass a church with its doors propped open on a summer evening and hear a hymn that does not follow a tune, stop and listen. Someone may be promising something you will live to see kept. The Davenport wedding remains unfinished on purpose now. School children on field trips learn about rice and ribbons, and if the teacher is brave, about ledgers too. They do not learn recipes. They learn the difference between silence that protects and silence that erases. They learn that a woman with no vote and no name in a book can still write a sentence the world can't stop reading. If they ask what happened to the girl in the kitchen, the guide shrugs in that Southern way that means many things at once and says, "The river knows." Then the bus door sighs, and the children climb aboard with their sack lunches and their questions, and the oaks along the lane lift their green arms over another departure, as if blessing and warning were two sides of the same leaf. What remains is this: a house that learned humility, a church that learned to share its breath with ghosts who don't need saving, a river that minds its business and everyone else's, and a sentence written in a hand that refused to ask permission. If you have stayed to the end, you have kept a small promise yourself to witness without flinching. That is the currency with which stories like this are bought and paid for across time. Spend it where it matters next,